I have governed Thornville for 12 years, without raising my voice. That is the first thing my advisors tell new arrivals at court, not my lineage, not my battle record, not the treaty I brokered at the River Nar that kept the marshland clans from bleeding each other dry for another generation. They lead with the voice. The Alpha King of Thornville, they say, as if reciting scripture, does not shout. They mean it as praise. I had come to think of it the same way. Composure is a kingdom's first wall. I learned that before I learned anything else about ruling. My father raged, and his court moved in tightened circles around him, cautious as wolves around a fire that had already burned someone. I swore I would be different, and I kept that oath 12 years running through drought years and flood years, through a challenge from the Valdine pack that I ended with 3 words and a look, through council sessions that would have made a lesser man put his fist through the table. I never shouted. I never flinched. I never lost my footing. And then she walked through my gate on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the autumn rains, to collect a debt. I knew her by name before I knew her by face. Everyone in Thornville did. Myra of no pack, that was what they called her. The of no pack part delivered with a particular careful inflection, as if the absence was a wound they were tactfully not mentioning. It was not a wound. I understood that the moment I saw her cross the outer courtyard, her travel cloak pushed back over one shoulder, her eyes moving across my gatehouse and my guards and my banners with the same flat professional attention a carpenter gives a wall she's been asked to assess. She was not impressed. She was not afraid. She was taking inventory. She had been hired 3 years ago by my steward Perrin, without my knowledge, which I later addressed, to recover a stolen shipment of Thornville iron moving through the eastern marshes. She had recovered it. She had also, according to Perrin's extremely detailed and slightly embarrassed account, discouraged 4 hired riders who'd been sent to stop her recovery, sent 3 of them home on foot, and delivered the iron with a written accounting so meticulous it had made my record-keeper weep with something approaching joy. The fee for this service had been agreed in writing. Perrin, operating under the false impression that packless fighters could be paid in halves and would not complain, had sent her 60% of the contracted amount, and a note explaining that the remainder would follow. It had not followed. Hence, Myra of no pack, standing in my outer courtyard 3 years later, having apparently decided that Thornville's debt was old enough. My court secretary came to me with the news while I was reviewing the autumn grain assessments. A fighter named Myra is at the gate, my lord. She says she has an outstanding contract with Thornville and would like it honored. She did not say please. I looked up. Something moved in my chest, not my wolf exactly, or not yet, more like the air pressure changing before a storm. I filed it under the general category of mildly interesting and told him to show her to the Eastern Receiving Hall. I made her wait 20 minutes. Not out of discourtesy, I had the grain reports to finish, but when I walked into the receiving hall and found her standing at the window rather than seated in either of the chairs provided, looking out at the river with her arms loose at her sides, I understood that the 20 minutes had cost me nothing at all. She had not chafed. She had not paced. She had simply stood at the window and looked at the river and waited, the way a patient person waits, not with resignation but with the comfortable stillness of someone who has somewhere else to be and is in no particular hurry to pretend otherwise. She turned when I came in. She did not bow. In 12 years, almost no one had walked into my receiving hall and not bowed. "Alpha King," she said, with exactly the neutrality of someone acknowledging a fact. "Myra," I said with the same. We looked at each other across the room for a moment that lasted slightly longer than it needed to, and I understood, quietly, the way you understand something before you fully form the words for it, that this was going to be a difficult conversation. Not because she would be difficult, because I was already paying close attention to her in a way that had nothing to do with the debt. She was lean and watchful, a fighter's economy in the way she held herself, nothing wasted, nothing performed. Her hair was dark and practical, pulled back from a face that was striking not for its softness but for the quality of its attention. She was looking at me the way she had looked at the courtyard, taking inventory. And there was something faintly, almost imperceptibly startling about being looked at like that, assessed rather than deferred to, that I found I did not dislike. My wolf, usually quiet in formal settings, was not quiet. He was not loud either, not surging or howling as I'd felt him in fights, in challenges, in moments of danger. He was just very awake. Alert in a way I wasn't used to, like a dog that has caught a scent it hasn't smelled before and is holding very still to make sure it's real. I gestured to the chair. She sat, which I took as a concession of some kind, though she made it look like her own idea. We talked about the debt. It was, as these things go, not complicated. Perrin had underpaid her. Thornville owed her a remaining 40% plus, she said, without particular heat, 3 years of reasonable interest on funds withheld. She produced the original contract from her travel pack, not a copy, the original with Perrin's seal, and laid it on the table between us. She had been carrying it, apparently, for 3 years. I looked at the document. I looked at her. I did not ask whether she'd considered simply returning sooner, because the answer was obvious in her posture. She had given Thornville 3 years to honor its word before she came to collect it in person, and she considered this more than generous. I agreed with her on all of it. Something crossed her face when I said that, a small flicker, not quite surprise but adjacent to it, there and gone so fast I might have imagined it. I thought I had surprised her. I found I wanted to do it again. I'll have the settlement drawn up today, I said. You'll have the full amount plus interest by morning. I can wait until morning, she said. And that was how Myra of No Pack came to be staying in Thornville for at least one night. My steward Aurel, not Perrin, who had been reassigned to grain inventory after the original incident, offered her a guest room in the East Wing. She accepted it without ceremony, asked where the practice yard was, and spent the remainder of the afternoon there. I know this because 3 of my guards reported it to me independently, each of them trying to be casual about it, and none of them succeeding. "She's very good," said the first guard, whose name was Toll and who had been with the Thornville garrison for 9 years. "She's exceptional," said the second guard, Veen, who had fought in 2 pack wars and was not easily impressed. The third guard, a young one named Castle who had been at the garrison 8 months, simply said, "My lord, should we be concerned?" And I told him no and dismissed him and sat for a moment in my study with my hands flat on my desk, examining the quality of my own attention. I was not concerned. I was curious. There is a difference, and I knew it well enough to name it, and naming it did not make it smaller. At dinner I invited her to the hall. Thornville kept a full table most evenings, my senior advisors, the pack council representatives, the occasional visiting lord or trader. Myra came to the hall in the same clothes she'd worn to the practice yard, freshened but not transformed, and sat where she was placed without rearranging herself to fit the room. The room arranged itself around her instead. I watched it happen from my seat at the head of the table. Conversations that had been pointed at her pulled back slightly, recalibrated, decided to approach at a different angle. She did not make small talk. She was not rude. She answered direct questions directly, asked a few of her own that were specific enough to be interesting, about the Marsh Treaty, about the pack council structure, about how Thornville managed its independent fighters, and ate her meal with the contained focus of someone who understood that food was fuel. She was not performing neutrality. She simply did not see the table as a stage. Lord Davin, who held the eastern marshland tributary and who had a talent for testing newcomers with the aggressive friendliness of a man who means to find the edge of them, asked her directly, "What does a packless fighter do when she gets old then? When she can't travel?" The table went fractionally quieter. I watched her. "The same thing a lord does when he gets old," Myra said, without looking up from her plate. "Whatever I managed to build." Davin laughed genuinely, not the polished laugh he used when he was deciding to be gracious. "Fair enough," he said and moved on. Across the table, my wolf advisor Solon caught my eye and held it for a beat too long. I looked away first, which was not a thing I normally did. After the meal, I walked her to the east corridor myself. I told myself this was ordinary courtesy. It may have been. It was also the only way I could think of to keep talking to her for another 5 minutes, and I was aware enough to find that noteworthy. We walked in comfortable silence for a stretch, which surprised me. She was not a person who filled silence nervously, and I had stopped doing that around the age of 20. The corridor ran along the river side of the hall, torchlit and reed fragrant, the marsh smell coming soft through the high windows. "Thornville is warmer than I expected," she said. "Not a complaint, an observation." "The river holds the heat," I said. "The marshes too, cold winters, but the stone remembers summer." She looked at the wall, actually looked at it, with the same inventory attention she gave everything. "Old stone," she said. "Very old." She nodded as if this confirmed something. We reached the east wing door. She stopped, turned slightly toward me, not quite facing me, the way she turned toward things she wasn't sure yet how to name. "Thank you," she said, "for not making this complicated." I thought about that. It was a legitimate debt, I said. "Most legitimate debts become complicated anyway," she said. I noticed. She looked at me then, a full direct look that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. And then she said good night and went inside, and I stood in the corridor for a moment with the torchlight moving on the old stone wall and my wolf perfectly, absolutely still, not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of total attention, and understood that I was going to need the settlement to take longer than one day. I did not manufacture the delay dishonestly. I want to be clear about that, because I am a man who has tried to run a fair kingdom, and I would not extend a debt settlement through deliberate dishonesty. But there are, in any complex financial agreement, genuine details to be resolved, the precise calculation of 3 years' interest, the form of the payment, the question of whether the record-keeper's notation on the original contract superseded the supplementary clause in Perrin's letter. And I may have asked my counsel to be thorough in a way that I had not always insisted on in simpler cases. It took 3 days. In those 3 days, I learned the following things about Myra of No Pack, some of them through direct conversation, and some of them through the increasingly detailed reports my guards continued to provide without being asked. She slept lightly and woke early. She spent an hour in the practice yard before most of the household was awake, alone, running forms I didn't recognize from any pack tradition I knew, clean and economical and almost meditative, as if the fighting was a kind of thinking. She ate well and without self-consciousness. She was scrupulously, almost aggressively fair. When she borrowed a whetstone from the armory, she returned it sharper than she'd found it, a fact the armorer brought to me personally as if reporting a miracle. She did not drink much. She did not flirt. She listened when people talked to her and said exactly as much as she meant. And this quality, which should have been unremarkable, seemed to unsettle people who were accustomed to conversation as a form of performance. She unsettled me too, but differently. Not in my chest, where I was keeping my composure intact with the dedication I had applied to it for 12 years. In the space underneath my composure, where my wolf lived. My wolf was behaving in a way I did not have a precedent for. He was not restless, he was not aggressive. He did not surge or pace or push toward her the way he pushed toward a threat or a challenge. He simply oriented. The way a plant turns to light, not frantically, not dramatically, just with a quiet and total consistency. When she was in a room, he knew. When she left one, he noted the absence. When I heard her voice across the training yard from my window, He went still in a way that was nothing like his usual stillness. I had been told about fated bonds. Every Alpha King is. My father's advisors explained it to me at 16, in the brisk and slightly embarrassed way people explain things they consider both important and vaguely mortifying. The bond, the mark, the recognition. I had listened carefully and filed it away as relevant someday. I had been 34 for 6 months, and someday had remained, as it had for 12 years, abstract. On the second evening, Myra came to dinner again. This time she sat slightly differently, not more at ease exactly, but slightly more rooted, the way a person sits in a place they've decided to stop treating as temporary. Lord Davin tested her again. A different question this time. Something about a pack war she'd apparently been hired to end 12 years ago in the Northern Territories. She told him what she'd done and why, concisely, and Davin listened with the careful attention he reserved for people he had decided were worth the effort. After dinner there was a small informal gathering in the hall, maps, territory updates, the usual autumn council review. She stayed, unremarkably, as if she had been attending these sessions for years. She asked one question about the marsh boundary markers on the eastern ridge, a question so specific and so well aimed that 2 of my council members stared at her for a moment before answering. I found myself watching her mouth when she talked. I stopped watching. I watched the maps. I felt my wolf settle into his particular oriented stillness, and I breathed steadily and kept my composure and thought, one more day. On the third day, a visitor arrived I had not expected. Lord Cern of the Kale Borderlands, a broad, easy-mannered man of middle years who held a tributary lord's seat on my council, and who rode to Thornville twice a year for the territory reviews, came in a day early because his road north had been faster than expected. I welcomed him as I always did. I showed him to the council chamber, and then, at the evening meal, he sat across from Myra and introduced himself with the warm, expansive confidence of a man who has been well received by women his whole life. She was civil. She always was. She answered his questions, where she'd traveled, what work she'd done in the marsh territory, whether she'd been to the Kale Borderlands. She was not warm, particularly, but Myra was never warm in the way that means encouraging. She was honest, which is different. She answered because answering was reasonable, and Cern received her answers as invitation because he was a man who received most things as invitation. I watched this from the head of the table and kept my face still. My wolf did not keep still, he paced. Not the challenge pace of a threatened male. I want to be precise about this, because I examined it carefully, because I am a man who tries to understand himself. It wasn't territorial aggression in the crude sense. It was something older and quieter and more absolute than that. A certainty. The way you feel in your body when something that is yours is in the wrong hands. Even if it was never in your hands yet, even if you've never said the word mine about it, even if you wouldn't have been able to explain 10 minutes ago why it applied. The meal ended. The company rose from the table. Someone, I think it was my council secretary, said something about the evening map review, and people began to drift in that direction, and Lord Cern turned to Myra and said, in the comfortable way of a man extending a courtesy, "May I?" and held out his hand to lead her toward the council chamber. And my mouth opened. 12 years. 12 years of composure, of governing by steadiness, of never raising my voice, of never saying a thing I hadn't considered from 3 directions first. 12 years of being the wall my court could put their back to when everything else felt uncertain. She is not yours, I said. I said it at normal volume. I didn't shout. I want to be clear about that. The 12 years held to that extent. But I said it into a room that had been in motion, and the room stopped. Not dramatically. Just stopped. Cern's hand stayed extended and then slowly lowered. The council secretary stopped mid-step. Aurel, my steward, turned from the doorway with an expression I had never seen on his face before, total blankness, as if the usual repertoire had simply vacated him. Myra turned and looked at me. The silence was complete. In it I felt something burn on my left wrist, not painfully, but unmistakably, the way a brand burns when it's been waiting years for the right fire. I looked down without meaning to. Through my sleeve I could feel it, the mate mark waking, warm and certain, like a coal that has been banked for a long time. I looked up. Myra's right hand was pressed flat against her own left wrist. Her face was perfectly controlled, but her eyes, I know what it looks like when someone receives information that rearranges their understanding of the room. She was receiving it. No one asked, she said. Her voice was level. Whatever was happening under it, the voice held. No, I said, no one did. Another silence. We should perhaps, said Solon, my wolf advisor, in the careful voice of a man speaking across the edge of a very steep drop, continue the map review. Nobody moved. I am going to tell you now exactly what I did, because I want to be honest about it, and because it is not the thing a composed king does. I crossed the room. Not striding, I am not a man who strides to make a point. I walked, at ordinary speed, across 20 feet of Thornville's great hall, with the torches burning in their brackets and the river smell coming through the high windows and the entirety of my senior council absolutely motionless behind me. I walked until I was 6 feet from her, and then I stopped, because I am not a man who crowds. She hadn't moved. She was still standing where CERN's invitation had found her, her hand still against her wrist, her eyes on me with the same quality of attention she gave everything, full and direct, and exactly as much as it was, nothing more or nothing less. I spoke without thinking, I said. I noticed, she said. I'm not going to apologize for it. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, reassessment. Why not? Because it was true. The hall was so quiet I could hear the river. You have a king's word for everything, don't you? She said. Not quite a question. I try to. What does it mean? She said, not angry, asking, pressing at the edge of the thing the way she pressed at everything, carefully, directly, to see if it would hold. When you say she is not yours, what does that mean in this hall in front of your council? I held her gaze. It means my wolf recognized you before I had the sense to. Before you had the sense to, she repeated. She was doing what she always did, taking inventory. It means, I said, that I have been looking for reasons to make the settlement take longer for 3 days. I noticed that too, she said. The smallest thing crossed her face then, not softness, not yet. Something more like the very beginning of warmth, carefully held, the way you hold a flame when the wind is uncertain. You could have said something, she said. I didn't know how, I said. I am better at speaking than I am at that kind of speaking. That's not a small admission, she said, for a king. No, I said, it's not. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at her wrist, not pulling her sleeve back, not yet, just pressing her palm against it the way you press a wound that isn't quite a wound. I have been alone, she said, for a long time by choice. I need you to know that. I know, I said. I'm not, she stopped. Started again, her voice level and careful as the contract she'd carried for 3 years. I'm not simple to live with. I don't know how to be a Luna. I have never wanted to be managed. I have noticed, I said, that you are not simple. I have also noticed I find this interesting rather than inconvenient. That might change. It might. She looked at me. You're not trying to close this quickly, she said. Most people try to close things quickly when they want them. I want this to hold, I said. Fast things don't always hold. Something in her settled, not the wolf settling of my last mate bond vision, not the grand cinematic moment, just a person deciding in a very private and very real way that the ground here might be solid enough to stand on. She took a breath. She looked down at her wrist again. Show me, she said. I pushed my left sleeve back. The mate mark was visible, a clean, deep amber glow through the skin, wolf-shaped. The mark that is not tattoo or scar but something older than either, the pack bond's oldest signal. I had seen marks on other people. I had never seen one on myself. It was stranger than I expected, more absolute. She looked at it for a long moment, then she pushed back her own sleeve. Her mark was already there. The same amber, the same shape, the same steadiness, not flaring or blazing, just burning with the quiet certainty of a thing that has been true for longer than either of us knew. The hall breathed. Behind me, I heard Solon make a sound, not quite words, but the sound of a man who has been advising an Alpha King for 8 years, and has just watched that Alpha King find his fated mate in front of the entire senior council, in a way he could not have planned if he'd tried. Lord Cern, to his very considerable credit, cleared his throat softly, said "Congratulations, my lord," in the tone of a man who has decided to take the situation entirely in stride, and withdrew toward the map room. The council followed him. It was, in the end, just the two of us. We talked until the torches burned low. This is not the part of the story people imagine when they imagine a mate bond. They imagine the mark, the recognition, the public claiming. They don't imagine sitting down, her on one side of the long council table, me on the other, the map still spread between us, and talking for 3 hours about the things that actually matter. She asked me what I wanted from a mate. I asked her what she needed from a pack. Neither of us had simple answers. She told me she had left the Veldrath pack at 22, not cast out left. I didn't fit, she said. I'm not saying they were wrong. I'm saying I didn't fit, and staying would have made both of us smaller. She had been on her own for 13 years. She knew how to operate alone with a precision that most pack wolves couldn't match, and she knew she had built her whole understanding of herself around that capability. I'm not going to pretend, she said, that I don't know how to be alone. That would be dishonest. I wouldn't want you to, I said. A pack comes with, she stopped. A pack comes with a great deal. It does, I said. A pack also comes with people who will have your back in the marsh when your left side is exposed. She looked at me across the maps. You've been reading my combat reports. Aurel mentioned the incident near the eastern ridge. 3 against 1. I was fine. You got through it. That's not the same as fine. Something moved in her eyes, not offense, exactly. More like the slight surprise of someone who hasn't been argued with that particular way before. You're very certain, she said, for a man who has known me 3 days. I am, I said. I have also been known to be right. She looked at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time in 3 days, the smallest edge of a smile, not warm and wide, nothing like that, just the very tip of something that lived underneath all the careful levelness. Don't get smug about it, she said. I won't, I said. I meant it. I also meant, I am going to remember this moment for the rest of my life. We talked about Thornville, what it was, how it worked, the Marsh Treaty and the Pack Council and the river routes. She asked questions that were exactly the right questions, the kind that mapped the structure of a thing rather than its surface. She understood systems. She understood the way power moved through spaces and the way obligations created shape. When she asked about the independent fighter's contract structure, I realized she was asking because she was thinking about how she fit into it, whether there was a shape she could occupy without losing the shape she'd built. I don't need you to be a different person, I said. She looked up. I need you to be the person who will tell me when I'm wrong, I said. Who will not treat my council chamber as a place she doesn't belong. Who will come back to Thornville when she goes out, not because she has to, but because she's chosen to. She was quiet for a moment. That's a strange thing to want, she said. Yes. Most people want. I know what most people want, I said. I've governed a court for 12 years. I've watched what people want. I want the person who sat at my dinner table for 3 nights and didn't perform anything, not deference, not charm, not availability. Just showed up and was exactly what she was. She pressed her lips together. She was thinking. I let her think. I'm going to keep contracts, she said finally. If there's work, if it's reasonable work. I would expect you to. I'm not going to call myself Luna in a title if I feel like calling myself Myra. That seems entirely reasonable. You're agreeing very quickly. I've been thinking about this for 3 days, I said. I was slow to start, but I've had time. This time the edge of a smile was slightly more than an edge. All right, she said. She pressed her palm against her wrist again over the mark. All right, I'll stay. Not permanently committed to anything yet. I'm telling you honestly, that's where I am. That's honest, I said. You're not bothered by that. No, I said. Honesty is easier to work with than performance. She looked at me across the maps, across the low torchlight, across the whole strange evening that had started with a dinner and ended with a mate bond, and the council quietly absenting themselves. She looked at me the way she had looked at the wall in the corridor, assessing whether the stone was what it claimed to be. The debt, she said, I still want the interest paid. I almost laughed. I caught it before it was quite that. It came out as a short exhaled sound instead, the kind of thing I had not made in the council chamber in years. The interest will be paid, I said, in full in the morning. She nodded. Good, she said, and then very quietly, as if she was practicing the weight of the word, Khan. My name in her mouth, for the first time, not Alpha King, not my title, just the name itself, said the way someone says a word they're deciding to keep. My wolf went absolutely, completely still, not the stillness of vigilance, the stillness of an animal that has come home. She stayed. Not because she had to. Not because the mark obligated her. I want to be clear about that, because I had spent 12 years learning that compliance built on obligation was worth considerably less than choice built on conviction, and this was not a lesson I intended to unlearn. She stayed because she decided to, on terms she negotiated with the same precision she brought to every contract, and because the ground here turned out to be solid, and because Thornvale's old warm stone and its river smell and its reeds at the window agreed with her in a way she told me later she hadn't been expecting. She spent a week in the guest wing, then 10 days, then she stopped counting because the counting felt administrative in a way that nothing else about it did. She attended council sessions with the focused presence of someone who has decided a thing is worth her attention, which in her case meant it actually received it. My advisors learned quickly that her questions were worth sitting with, that her silences meant thought rather than absence, and that the words she finally delivered were almost always the thing they should have been thinking about 10 minutes earlier. Davin, who had tested her at the first dinner, became one of her most consistent allies in the council chamber. They disagreed sharply twice in the first month, once about the Eastern Marsh boundary, and once about the independent fighters' contract structure. And both times she held her ground with such clear and specific reasoning that Davin revised his position, not with bad grace, but with the genuine pleasure of a man who has encountered an argument better than his own. She's going to be useful, he said to me, with the tone of a man paying the highest compliment he knows. She's not here to be useful, I said. He thought about that. No, he said, I suppose not, but she is anyway. Cern, the visiting border lord, came to me privately before he left for the Kale borderlands, about 4 days after the evening in the hall. He was a gracious man, and I had never had cause to doubt his character, and he proved it now. I hope I didn't complicate things, he said simply. You didn't, I said, if anything. Yes, he said with a small smile. I thought something like that might be the case. My congratulations, genuinely. He left in good spirits. I was grateful for him. The mate bond settled over the weeks that followed, not the way fire settles when it burns out, but the way a river settles into its right course after a disruption, certain and directional and building momentum rather than losing it. We ate dinner together more often than not. We walked the river wall in the evening sometimes, in the same comfortable silence we discovered in the East Corridor on her first night, which turned out to be a silence we both moved well in. She went out twice in the first 6 weeks, once to settle a boundary dispute in the Southern Marsh, work she had already been hired for before Thornville, and once to collect an old equipment debt from a merchant in the Nar Territory. And both times she came back, which was what I had asked for, which was what she had agreed to, which was what she chose. When she came back the first time, late in the evening, her travel cloak damp from the marsh mist, I was in my study. Aurel knocked and said simply, "She's back, my lord." And I realized I had known that already, had felt the shift in my wolf a few minutes before, the orientation adjusting toward the gate, and I said thank you and kept my composure and finished the dispatch I was writing, and then I went to find her. She was in the practice yard. Of course she was. She'd been riding for 6 hours and the first thing she wanted was to move. I sat on the yard wall and watched her run forms in the torchlight, and she did not stop or adjust or acknowledge me for about 10 minutes, which was appropriate and correct, and then she did. "Anything happen while I was out?" she asked. "Grain Council voted on the winter reserve allocation," I said. "Davin still fighting the Eastern Ridge boundary notation. The cook made a lamb pie that Solon ate most of before the rest of us arrived." She ran through the last sequence, stopped, pushed her hair back. "I missed dinner," she said. "There's lamb pie left," I said, barely. She crossed to the yard wall and sat beside me, not touching, just close enough that my wolf was entirely content. She was breathing a little hard from the forms, her face warm from the exertion, and she smelled like marsh water and iron and the particular clean cold of open riding, and something in me that had been held carefully in readiness for 6 days released like a hand unclenching. "Good trip," I said. "Productive," she said. "The boundary dispute was messier than the letter indicated. The merchant paid up immediately, which was boring. You wanted a fight." "I wanted to be right," she said. "I was right, it just didn't take very long." I looked at her profile in the torchlight. She was looking at the practice yard with the comfortable private attention she gave to things after she decided they were hers. "You came back," I said. She turned and looked at me. "Khan," she said with a very particular level patience, "I said I would." "I know," I said. "Then why does it sound like a question?" "I thought about this. Because I've been running this kingdom for 12 years, I said, by assuming that nothing is certain. It's a useful habit." She looked at me for a moment. Then she turned back to the practice yard and said, "I'm not a grain shipment. I don't need to be tracked in the ledger." "I know." "But," she said, and something in her voice shifted slightly, the way a tide shifts, not dramatically, not all at once, but with real direction. "I do understand that you were paying attention while I was gone." "I was." She stopped. "That's different," she said, "from being managed." "It is," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The lamb pie. What about it?" "I would like some of it before Solon finishes it." I stood. I offered her my hand, not as a claiming, not as a gesture of ownership, just as a king who had been sitting on a yard wall offering a practical hand to a person who'd been riding for 6 hours. She looked at it for exactly the beat she needed to, and then she took it, and we walked back into Thornville's warm old halls, and that was that. The pack knew. There is no keeping a mate mark from a pack that lives close. The scent shifts, the alpha's orientation changes, the energy of the hold is different in the way a room is different when a door has been opened that had previously been shut. My senior wolves had known from the evening in the hall. The broader pack knew within a week of her staying, the way packs know things, gradually and then completely, in the same way a marsh fills by increments, and then it's full. There was very little resistance. I will be honest, I had anticipated some. A packless mate was not a traditional choice, and my counsel was not a traditional counsel in every respect but maintained some traditional perspectives. I had rehearsed, in my mind, the arguments I would need to make about the bond's authority, about what the mark meant, about Myra's capability and character, and the fact that my word was, in the end, the relevant word. I didn't need most of them. The council had watched her in session for 3 weeks. They had watched her hold her ground with Davin. They had watched her ask the Eastern Ridge question that 2 of my best territorial advisors had not thought to ask. They had watched her return from the marsh trip and sit in the practice yard until she was ready to sit at the table, not out of disrespect, but out of a personal integrity that was more visible than almost anything. The question, said Solon in the one direct conversation we had about it, was never whether she was capable. The question was whether she was ours. He paused. The mark answered that. The rest of it is detail. I told her about that conversation. She thought about it for a while. Ours, she said, that's a large word. It is, I said. I'm getting there, she said. I want you to know that. It's not, she stopped and started again with the careful precision she brought to saying things she hadn't said before. It's not that I don't feel it, the bond. I feel it. I'm not pretending otherwise. It's that I've been a particular person, in a particular way, for a long time, and I'm not interested in losing that person in the process of becoming something else. I know, I said. You keep saying that. Because I keep meaning it. She looked at me. And if I'm wrong, she said, if this is, she stopped. I've been wrong about things before, about where I fit, about what would hold. Then you're wrong, I said, and we work with that. But I've spent 12 years not making assumptions about outcomes, and what I can tell you is that you fit here in ways that are visible from the outside, even when they're not visible from the inside. The council can see it. I can see it. You're very certain, she said for the second time. I have been known, I said, to be right. The small edge of a smile again, the one I was learning to read, the one that lived under all the levelness and was worth the wait. Don't get smug about it, she said. I won't, I said, I never will. The formal claiming happened on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the evening in the hall, at the Autumn Council Assembly. I want to be clear about what that meant and what it didn't mean. It was not a coronation. It was not a performance of ownership. It was the thing that pack tradition requires, the Alpha King's public acknowledgement of his fated mate, spoken into the assembly with the council as witness, the mate mark visible on both of them, and then, afterward, the pack's acknowledgement in return. It has weight because it makes a private truth a public one, and public truths carry obligations that private ones don't, and that seemed right to both of us. She had agreed to it with the careful and specific agreement she gave to things she decided were right. It means something, she said. Fine, then it should be said in the right place. The right place was the Assembly Hall, Thornville's great gathering room, redrafted and riverlit. The whole pack council present, the tributary lords, the garrison, the household. Myra stood beside me in the clothes she had brought with her, which were dark and practical and suited her entirely, and I acknowledged the bond before the assembly in the language the tradition required, and she held my gaze through all of it with the direct and level attention she gave to everything. When I was done, the hall was quiet for a moment. Then Solon, on my right, said, "The Alpha King has spoken," the traditional response, and behind him the council echoed it, and behind them the pack, and the sound of it was the sound of a room deciding something is true. Myra looked at the hall looked back. "Well," she said at a volume that carried, "carry on then." The hall laughed, surprised and genuine, the way laughter is when it wasn't planned. Even Davin, even my most formally inclined council members. I felt it move through the room the way warmth moves through old stone, slowly, and then thoroughly. She glanced at me sidelong. "Was that appropriate?" she said quietly. It was perfect, I said. The feast went long. She sat beside me at the high table and ate her meal without ceremony, and answered direct questions directly and asked a few of her own. And Thornville folded her in, not noisily, not with the grand gestures of a court that wants to be seen welcoming someone, but in the quiet specific ways that matter. Toll the guard, who had first reported her skill in the practice yard, brought her a cup without being asked, and set it in front of her with the brief nod he used for people he decided were all right. The cook sent out an extra plate of lamb pie and Solon ate only half of it. Castle, the young guard, stopped looking worried every time she came through a door. Lord Davin, departing late in the evening, said to me as he pulled on his riding cloak, "I was wrong about the Eastern Ridge for what it's worth. She was right. I'm putting it in my next territory report." "She'll be pleased to hear it," I said. "She'll say, 'I know,'" Davin said, with a grin that I had not seen on him in a long time. He was not wrong. I said at the beginning that I had governed 12 years without raising my voice. That is still true. I have not raised it since. But I have spoken in rooms since that evening in the hall, spoken plainly, without calculation, without the composure wall I'd been building for 12 years. In ways I had not let myself before, and the kingdom has not fallen and the court has not been diminished, and the wall, it turns out, is still standing. It is a different kind of wall, more like the old stone of Thornville's halls, not rigid but certain, holding its shape through floods and seasons, not because it refuses to shift, but because the foundations are deep and true. I did not know I could be that kind of steady until she showed me what steady looked like when it came from choice rather than performance. She is here now. Not every day. She went north last month for a contract, a boundary-marking task in the Seville Marsh that she'd agreed to before Thornville, and she came back when the work was done, as she said she would, her pack smelling of cold water and iron and the open northern air that always clings to her for a day after a long ride. She will go again. She is that kind of person, and I knew that before the bond, and I am glad for it, because the Myra who sits beside me at the council table and walks the river wall in the evenings is the same Myra who can handle 3 hired riders at once in the Eastern Marsh, and those two things are not separate. Last night she came to find me in my study after dinner, which she does sometimes, and sat in the chair across from my desk, the same chair she sat in on the first day, when she put the contract on the table between us. She had a piece of Thornville's mapping parchment in her hand, the Eastern Ridge notation, and she had several specific things to say about Davin's revised report and 2 corrections she wanted to make before it went to the territorial record. I listened, I agreed with the corrections, I made a note. She set the parchment on the desk and sat back and looked at me, and the torchlight was warm on her face, and the river was audible through the high window, and outside the reeds were moving in the autumn wind. "The interest," she said. "Paid in full," I said. "That was 6 weeks ago." "I know," she said. "I'm keeping a new ledger." I looked up from the note. "Of things that held," she said simply. My wolf was very still, not the absolute stillness of that first evening, the stunned stillness of recognition. This was different, warmer, a stillness that knew itself, the stillness of something that has found its bearing and intends to keep it. "How many entries?" I said. She thought about it. "Enough," she said, "to stop counting."